that they create, right? They would just have the same quantity as a classical, as an efficient competitive equilibrium would lead to, right? So the idea of price discrimination is how a firm goes about capturing the surplus of those inframarginal consumers. Under first degree or perfect price discrimination, the firm will be able to capture all of that surplus, and that will lead to efficiency. But there's going to be some important practical limitations on implementing that. Second degree or quantity-based price discrimination, which is also related to quality-based price discrimination, is going to be one imperfect form of price discrimination, where firms charge different prices for different units of the same good in order to try to induce people who have a large value for the good to pay more in order to get more or a higher quality version of the product. And I'll talk about some cases when second-degree price discrimination is attractive and some cases where it's quite unattractive, and therefore that you'll get sort of efficient provision of goods conditional on people purchasing anything. Then I'll talk about some more exotic forms of price discrimination and wrap up by talking about perhaps the most common and interesting form of price discrimination, which is also imperfect, and it's called third-degree or identity-based price discrimination, where we discriminate against different people based on observable characteristics they have. And then we'll talk a little bit about policy applications and implications, both when is price discrimination beneficial and harmful, and how it's used in the design of auctions. OK. So David Wang, could you tell me what first-degree price discrimination is, what it means?
Right. So first-degree price discrimination is basically matching each price from the sell side to the buyer's willingness to pay.
Exactly. Exactly right. So you give everyone a personalized price on every unit that they purchase, so that you exactly match the total willingness they have to pay for the product to the price that they're charged, and you sell them the maximum amount that they'd be willing to pay more than the cost of producing that good for. Right? Now, we rarely observe this in the real world. It's really a theoretical benchmark, but there's some things that get close to it. So if you have a seller who bargains with the buyer or haggles with the buyer and is very competent, he might be able to look right into your eyes and figure out exactly what's the maximum he could demand from you before you'll walk away, right? And that's sort of close to first-degree price discrimination. Another example is personalized pricing systems on the internet. So on the internet, often you can, when you're looking for a ticket, get like a personalized deal targeted exactly at you that's trying to hit exactly what your willingness to pay is. Or sometimes Amazon will actually adjust its prices that it's charging you based on your previous purchase history to try to get exactly at what your value is. CVS has a similar but less detailed system where the coupons that you get from them are based on your previous check-ins and purchases at CVS, and that's sort of a similar attempt to get at first-degree price discrimination. Now, first-degree price discrimination is the best possible thing for the monopolist because he extracts the total consumer surplus, right? And therefore, companies are always going to look for better ways to try to slice up the groups of consumers and charge them different amounts. But this is terrible for consumers because they're going to get no surplus, right? All that consumer surplus goes away if the firm is extracting it all. Now, Kevin, how about social value? Is it socially beneficial for there to be first-degree price discrimination or not?
Well, it's going to give you the most socially optimal outcome because, I mean, the consumers will just pay exactly what they value the product to be. It's just that the entire surplus is going to go to the the monopolist.
Yeah, it's socially optimal because when the firm captures all the value that consumers earn, the firm has an incentive to sell all of the units up to the point where the willingness to pay of the consumer is equal to cost. Because if any value that the consumer gets that's above cost is captured by the firm, then the firm has an incentive to sell to anyone who's willing to pay more than the cost because they'll capture that full value, right? And they, just to give a graphical illustration of this. So if the monopolist has a cost here and the demand is like that, usually the monopolist would have to say, oh, well, I'll sort of charge here and get this part. But under the first degree price discrimination, the monopolist can instead say, oh, here's this guy. I'm going to charge him that much. And this guy, I'll charge him that much. And by personalizing it, they are able to chop this whole thing up and get the full surplus that's under the demand curve. Now, Israel, what is it that first-degree price discrimination does to break the inefficiency that's created by monopoly? What sort of bind does it get the monopolist out of?
Well, it allows them to increase their output to more consumers.
Yep.
Without lowering the price. They're just going to price to whatever that consumer is willing to pay.
Exactly. So they're able to sell more units by lowering the price to the marginal consumers without having to lower the price to the inframarginal consumers, and therefore the trade-off that they usually face through price discrimination disappears, right? But the seller captures all the value and the consumers gain no surplus, and so that brings up important distributive issues. And in fact, it makes price discrimination often quite unpopular. But because price discrimination is more efficient, it should be possible to redistribute resources in such a way as to make it better than monopoly without price discrimination. So one way to do that is you could have different people bid for the right to be the monopolist, who is then going to have the right to do first-degree price discrimination. If there's enough competition in that bidding, the government will raise all the revenues that are equal to the profits the monopolist makes, and then they can spend that on whatever public project they want or give it back to consumers. Another way you can do it is through a profits tax. Now, that's not the same as a corporate income tax, because corporate income taxes are really taxes on people who are putting their capital into the market. This has to be on the basis of the excess economic profits that the firm makes. But part of the idea of a corporate income tax is to try to capture some of those things. Another way you could do this is if the government can't really distinguish between what is like the return that you're naturally making to adjust for your risk on your capital, unions who are like actually there and like looking at the goings on of the firm might be able to distinguish better between what's, you know, the return on capital and what is the actual like economic profit that the firm is making. And therefore, one role that a labor union might play is to try to figure out what the firm's profits are and to extract those and give them to someone who the government wants to distribute more money to workers who are less well off than the people who own the firm are. Now, none of these solutions is really as perfect as it sounds because they require a lot of information. So the redistributive authority would need to know what is economic profits, what's the return on capital. The competitors in the bidding for the monopoly franchise would have to know, as well as the winner of the auction, how much the value of the monopoly franchise was worth in order to get the top guy to bid the full profits that he's making, and so forth, right? Furthermore, there could be some benefits to not redistributing this money, not trying to extract it from the firm, because as we'll talk about on Thursday, if the firm captures the full social value associated with creating the product, then they'll have an incentive to innovate a lot, right? And so that might be one reason why we don't want the firm to just have that revenue extracted from them. And these basic lessons about whether we want to redistribute stuff and some of the challenges in doing it apply not just to perfect first-degree price discrimination, but to all the forms of price discrimination that we'll talk about during lecture today. Okay, now whatever its merits, first-degree price discrimination is very difficult to implement in practice. And this is why we pretty rarely see it actually occurring. So where's Kay? Okay. What are some of the practical barriers to implementing first-degree price discrimination?
Well, you need to know people's willingness to pay.
Yeah. So the biggest one is informational, as Kay was saying, right? You need to know how much every single person is willing to pay for the product, right? And so, in fact, we can see the distortion from monopoly is really arising from the fact that the monopolist doesn't know everyone's willingness to pay. It's really an informational limitation of the monopolist. But there are some other limits that might come up. One is just administrative. You need to be able to quote to every consumer a different price, right? And for a ordinary store, that might be quite difficult to do, to have someone there to actually say, oh, here's your price. And similarly, people might feel it was very unfair, or they might feel that they don't want to come back to a store where they can't predict what their price is going to be until they walk into the store, right? Another issue is that someone might buy the good for someone else, right? Someone who's willing to pay less might buy it for someone who's willing to pay more and pocket the difference themselves, right? And just to see how these problems arise, let's think about some practical versions of this. So one example is prescription drugs. Oh, yeah, David.
Yeah, just a quick question
Yeah.
about the willingness to pay
Yeah.
aspect. Given the fact that it's a monopoly and there's probably that the monopoly is the only supplier,
Yeah.
how does that affect people's willingness to pay in that respect then? Because there's only one possible price that they're like.
Yeah, so I mean, in the absence of monopoly, price discrimination becomes harder because, of course, you could always go and buy it. Someone else is going to be competing for those same people. And those same people are not going to necessarily be inelastic with respect to your price. They might only be inelastic with respect to the industry price. But as long as the firm retains some market power, there will be still some people who particularly want to buy their product rather than another firm's product, right?
Okay.
And that might make it possible for them to still do some price discrimination. But in fact, you can explain some patterns of price discrimination, particularly with respect to competition. So like one reason, as we'll talk about, that seniors might get discounts is not that seniors are willing to pay less for watching a movie. It might be just that seniors have like a lot of time on their hands to like walk around and look at the prices of all the different movie theaters or drive to somewhere far away to get the ticket rather than going to the nearby place. And if that's the case, you use it as a way to like target a discount to someone who's like very easily able to shop around for the lower price, right? Okay, so to think about some of the barriers to implementing rigorous price discrimination,